short, sharp introduction is always appreciated. Thank you very much, Mr. President Lawrence. Also to Zara Kinton, an old friend of mine. Fantastic to see you.
A young friend.
Young friend.
Friend of old.
A friend of, oh, there you go. I'm already in trouble and I've only said about 4 words. But it's great to see you as well. And to the AIIA, it's fantastic to be here. I have, at different stages, been a member of the AIIA, based largely on whether I remind myself to fill out the membership form and pay the credit card details. But it's an organisation that does fantastic work, particularly I think for young people. And this includes myself. Of course, I'm still young, but when I was at university, I regularly turned up to AIIA events to listen, to hear, to be challenged, to seek out expertise and advice from people who had worthy and credible opinions. And I think the AIIA plays an incredibly important role, and I know there are a lot of young people here tonight, and it's part of its enduring task, not just to be a forum for people interested in international affairs, particularly those who have had a past experience or knowledge or practice because they've been in academia or the diplomatic corps or anything else, or business including, but also to engage and educate the next generation of Australians. And that is more important than ever, because while Australians travel around the world and have enormous opportunities, even which I did not have when at university, it now seems like when you go to uni you pretty much get to go as part of your course, or it's required as part of your course to spend time overseas, that they not just get to enjoy the fruits of fun and entertainment overseas, but also to understand the cultures, the traditions, and the political framework that works, that not just informs the development of those countries, but also then goes to inform the world in which we live in and the impact it has on Australia. So I really do want to pay credit to you, Mr. President, to everybody who's here, because you are part of a long-standing tradition which should make Victoria proud. And I'm glad to see you still even at the same very salubrious location in East Melbourne. Tonight, as Lawrence has said, he'd like me to talk about freedom and whether it's under pressure globally, and I think the answer, of course, is eternally yes. It doesn't matter what's happening at any point in time. We are part of a long pathway of human endeavour, as Ronald Reagan would put it, to take us from the swamp to the stars, and that there are always going to be challenges in freedom, but I think we're at a particularly interesting moment in time, and this won't surprise anybody, least of all after the events of today. But before I begin my remarks, I'm just going to give a bit of feedback and advice about the Human Rights Commission, because I'm currently completing a national consultation on rights and responsibilities around the country. We haven't done Victoria yet, so there will be events to come up which you are most welcome to participate in. But there seems to be a lot of confusion about the Human Rights Commission, how it operates, and what different commissioners' roles are. So I'll just give a quick outline. I was appointed, of course, earlier this year to be Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, which is an independent statutory office established by Parliament under the Australian Human Rights Commission Act. But I am only one of 7 commissioners at the Human Rights Commission. There's also the President of the Commission, Professor Gillian Triggs, who I understand is speaking at the National Conference in Canberra on Sunday, was it Monday? Monday. And will no doubt talk to you about the incredible work she is doing in terms of the children in detention inquiry, but also in many other areas of international public policy, of which that is her background, particularly with relation to international maritime law. She is also, in terms of the division of responsibilities between the President of the Commission and myself, she basically takes international and asylum seekers. I take everything that's domestic. That's how we've kind of worked that out as sort of a resolution between us. But additionally, there's also the Age, Disability, Race and Sex Discrimination Commissioners. And the Age and Disability Discrimination portfolio is currently held by the same person, Susan Ryan. Race discrimination is held by Dr. Tim Parmesan, and the Sex Discrimination Commissioner is one of the most influential woman, I think, just about in the country at the moment. If you read the front page of the Australian Financial Review, Elizabeth Broderick, all of which, of course, I have enormous respect for. There's also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, Mick Gooder, and the Children's Commissioner, Megan Mitchell. So we all have our own defined areas or portfolio responsibilities. But of course mine is actually the broadest, which is all human rights within Australia. And of course there's a lot of issues that overlap with the areas of my colleagues, so I tend to focus on domestic, civil and political rights, which I think, one, is consistent with the title that the government gave me when I was appointed, which is that I would be the Freedom Commissioner, but also to make sure that I don't too much create problems with my other commissioners and overlap in their responsibilities. And in doing so, I'm focusing on 4 fundamental freedoms, or rights and freedoms. The first is freedom of speech, freedom of association, religious worship, and property rights. And when I was appointed, a lot of people commented that there aren't really problems with these issues in this country. Yet, I think since I have been appointed, it's been shocking, including even to me, just how many issues have actually arisen. Particularly, obviously, we have ongoing debates around freedom of speech, and there were discussions around reforming the Racial Discrimination Act, but that was really only the beginning of the discussion. After that, we've had significant challenges in terms of national terrorism laws or national security laws, as well as in areas like religious freedom, where we're talking about the right of people to wear head veils or coverings based on attachment to their religious faith. And of course, only today I met with some significant religious figures in Sydney, and they're concerned about the threat to freedom of religion that comes from same-sex couples being married, which most people now accept is probably going to happen under law. But what does that mean for civil celebrants who decide they don't want same-sex couples to get married, or for them to have to marry people who are in a same-sex relationship? What does it mean for cake makers? What does it mean for wedding photographers who feel that their conscience suggests that they shouldn't have to involve themselves in these ceremonies? These are real issues. They go to the heart of people's identity, their sense of security and safety in society, and very much to the heart of their conscience themselves. And so I seek to work with them constructively to make sure that we can have both rights, responsibilities and freedoms, but also to make sure we get a proper measure between them. Similarly with freedom of association, these issues have come up as a consequence of Queensland and New South Wales anti-bikie laws, anti-consorting laws. And of course, it's one of the great challenges of this office is normally you only ever really need to defend freedom of rights in a situation where scoundrels are having their rights trampled on. In the same way with freedom of speech, we are never recalled in to defend the principle because of the excessive use of please and thank you. Similarly, we don't tend to try and restrict freedom of association between friends who are catching up. But we do tend to want to do it for criminals and people who we don't otherwise like. But they're the people we need to defend most if we want to preserve our rights and freedoms. Not to suggest that we should ignore their crimes or anything that has been alleged against them, but we shouldn't be junking fundamental human rights and freedoms in the process to make it easier or more efficient for the police to do their work simply because they can't find or substantiate a crime that has been achieved. Now that's a controversial proposition on my part, but it's one I'll proudly defend and happy to answer questions about that. But actually one of the ones that I think most people are surprised about in terms of the enormous number of issues in this country, and one of which has drawn the most attention in my work today, is property rights. And property rights to me is central to the discussion around human rights and cannot be severed from the discussion. And yet it's one of the areas that the least focus goes into human rights and human rights discussion in this country. Many people talk to me about it and how I include it in discussions around human rights and suggest that this is just the interests of white rich people. But the reality is property rights go to the heart of security of everybody in society, particularly when you talk about it in its broadest context. The very basis of human rights to me isn't international treaties. It's a philosophical principle that people own their own bodies and their own lives, and they should be free to pursue their own opportunities and their enterprise. That is a property right. Intellectual property is a form of property right and is necessary for our creative endeavours, for artistic purposes, for innovation, and as a foundation for so much of our market economy. And of course, property rights generally are a foundation of our market economy. But even if we take it in the more traditional sense of physical property rights, like property that I may own nearby here or other people may own somewhere in the great state of Victoria, property rights are central to people's sense of security in the world. It's a reflection of their labours and their capacity to use their body to go out and enjoy the fruits of their effort. To ignore that as part of the discussion around human rights, I find simply bizarre. And if you want to see the consequences of what happens when people don't have property rights, and how much that does affect as an approach to their human rights and their sense of security, just look at what happens in places like China. Now these days it's somewhat better, where they do have a certain degree of property right protection. But if you've worked your entire life for a particular purpose, to save, to invest in your own future, to create wealth for your family and your children, and then to have that simply removed without compensation by the state is a very real infringement on people's human rights and needs to be considered that way. But even if you take it out of the context of what happens to people in the suburbs of Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or anywhere else, let's look at how property rights affects Aboriginal people. And one of the things I've done as part of this national consultations to date is spend a lot of time in the north of the country, partly because I'm very interested in Aboriginal issues, but partly also because they have a rainy season. I want to get up there before it sets in. But when you look at so many of the issues that affect Aboriginal people today, it comes from an absence of property rights. And yes, there is a long legacy, and yes, there are lots of issues around justice that come as a consequence of that, and I'm not skirting around that whatsoever. But if we are to see a situation where Aboriginal Australians are able to reach the same standard of living and opportunity that we have, property rights must be part of the discussion. We have a system built off the back of a significant High Court case around native title, which places enormous restrictions on what Aboriginal people can do with their land. It corrodes their very opportunity to participate fully in a market economy and to invest themselves in their own future. Recently I was in the Kimberley in Broome with the Yaru mob, which is Pat Dodson's mob, talking to them about the real challenges they face in terms of restrictions on their property rights and how much it undermines their capacity to develop housing for their people, jobs for their people, tourism opportunities. I mean, if you've ever seen Cable Beach, and I'm sure many of you have, they basically own all of Broome, that particular Aboriginal community, and yet they're restrained in just about every way with what they can do with it. And from somebody who's pro-enterprise, I see the least commercial opportunity in that, but somebody who's also deeply interested as part of that discussion in human rights, I see the lost human potential. And it needs to be included as part of the discussion, and so I am very proud to make sure that that is part of the discussion. And that's one of the great challenges I think we face in human rights today, is that people don't actually understand what they are. Now, people will disagree with me. In fact, everywhere I go, people disagree with me, but I've never found anybody who's been able to say much about what they think human rights are unless they've actually studied in an academic sense. And so that's what I mean when I say the public understanding of human rights is very limited and restricted. People have a rough idea and they think, well, yes, I've got a right to free speech, which of course, in a technical sense in Australia, we don't. But too often they point to documents and instruments like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I'm not disputing is an important document in its own right, and other international treaties as evidence of human rights. But I maintain my very strong view that these treaties, while all very nice, are fundamentally worthless. At the end, it is a lived culture of rights and responsibilities that is necessary to celebrate human rights. And of course, you can always go with the comparison. It's a bit stark, but it's real, which is the former Soviet Union, of course, had the freest constitution in the world, but no lived culture. We have virtually no human rights protections in this country, but I think we could comfortably say, even with our shortcomings, we have a lived culture of rights. And that's what we should be aiming for. That's how we should be approaching it. So I'm somewhat dismissive and disinterested in what international human rights treaties say, least because I think they actually corrode human rights itself. Because in the end, human rights have actually evolved over hundreds of years of events and thinking from particularly Europe and the United States, and have founded and framed our liberal democratic tradition. It was, of course, the signing 799 years ago, meaning 800 years next year, of the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter of 1215 by King John, that led to constraints on the power of the monarchy. It was liberal Enlightenment thinking that universalised human rights principles for all people in the Dominions in the 17th century through great philosophers such as John Stuart Mill and John Locke. These influences led to the social, economic and legal framework that, of course, many of us living in liberal democracies largely enjoy but also take for granted. It provided the foundation for the United States' Declaration of Independence, that asserted that all people are created equal and have rights to life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and sentiments echoed, of course, in their Constitution and Bill of Rights. Similar sentiments were echoed in France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which proclaimed that all citizens are to be guaranteed the rights of liberty, property, security and resistance to oppression. And while Enlightenment thinking concluded everybody had foundational human rights, it was, of course, the 1948 Universal Declaration that took these principles from Western liberal democracies and essentially globalised them. The Declaration was built on Franklin Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Union address that prescribed a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first 2, of course, was Roosevelt's essential freedoms were freedom of speech and freedom of worship. They, of course, directly come from the liberal tradition of human rights, which is about the individual and the capacity to exercise their rights. The third was freedom from want, meaning securing, and I quote, every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants, end quote. The fourth was freedom from fear, meaning, quote, that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbour. The latter 2, of course, reflect the politics of the day, and particularly the politics of the Second World War and the Great Depression. More importantly, though, the last 2 freedoms were a departure from the traditional liberal approach to human rights about the rights of the individual. These 2 freedoms formally established the idea that freedoms can exist without corresponding individual rights, that rights cease to be about individual autonomy, and that new rights could just be gifted by a government and we could just imagine them. I maintain a very strong opposition to this view. When we talk about rights and freedoms, of course, we too often talk about them interchangeably. But rights are what individuals have. Freedom is the exercise of those rights. So to give a very clear example, you have a right to religion or religious worship, but you have the freedom to be Catholic or Protestant or Muslim or any of the above. But it has to be linked back to a right. So when you start talking about freedoms without rights, you're no longer talking about human rights. You're talking about other aspirations and principles that you may think are very worthy, but you are not talking about human rights. And of course, these sorts of principles were then littered through the Universal Declaration and the subsequent international human rights treaties, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the UN system has continued to add new human rights to this list. And I would argue that has led to the dilution of their integrity, because human rights used to be sacrosanct principles about the rights of the individual. When they just become a grab bag of anything the UN decides at any given time negotiated by countries, they cease to be sacrosanct principles. They become essentially worthy aspirations, which constantly come into conflict and undermine the basic principles of human rights. Because when you think about those foundational ones, they can basically all be exercised consistently without undermining any other rights. Yes, there's contest from time to time, but they remain consistent principles. But when you throw every other civil justice, social justice or civil aspiration in there, it fundamentally undermines preserving and protecting human rights. And that's bad, of course, for the individual, because preserving and protecting human rights is essential to ensure that individuals are not treated merely as a cog in the machines of government, society, or the economy. At the heart of human rights itself is the dignity of the individual, and we simply can't afford to take those things for granted. So in that context, is freedom under pressure globally? And of course the answer is it's a mixed picture. There are of course huge advancements in the world around equality before the law and social equality, particularly around advancing women's interests, not just in terms of making sure that they're treated equally under the law and have the same standards, at least in law, as men. But of course, there have been huge advances in terms of attitudes towards women's liberation and the opportunity for economic advancement. And of course, there are lots of movements that have contributed to that. And we should pay homage to those movements because it fundamentally gets partly to the issue of both rights and the importance of justice. Of course, globally, we know, broadly speaking, that living standards are continuing to rise. And economic opportunity built off the back of property rights is very exciting. Similarly, we are experiencing wonderful opportunities in terms of health. There has been a huge global shift from focusing from communicable diseases to non-communicable diseases, apart from, of course, issues around Ebola at the moment. In a strange way, non-communicable diseases are diseases of freedom, and it's a good thing. Because, of course, once upon a time, people died of things that were communicable, which they didn't seek to attract. Whereas now people are essentially dying as the consequence of being liberated from communicable diseases as a consequence of innovation from medicines that were driven by and underpinned by property rights, but also, of course, because they're living longer, because of higher standards of living, but they're also, of course, facing enormous challenge as a consequence of their own consumption and behaviour. But they're dying because of their behaviour rather than being robbed of that choice by nature. Of course, there are lots of issues around inequity which are being challenged, which are much more about justice aspirations, but nonetheless form the degree of freedom people may enjoy, but also to make sure that we tackle challenge around freedom in some particularly developing countries. And that's where, for instance, issues around economic freedom are generally heading in the right direction, even in Cuba and North Korea, bizarrely. One of the biggest achievements, I think, of humankind has been this consequent economic behaviour after the global financial crisis. Now, I'm not suggesting things like stimulus are a good idea, I don't think they are. But I think one of the great achievements of the GFC or the post-GFC era is that we didn't retreat into an era of economic protectionism. Yes, some countries increased their tariffs, we know that. But that was normally within the strict rules were applied by the World Trade Organization between their bound and applied rates, or what they call water in trade terms. But generally speaking, economies didn't become more restrictive. And now there is actually a renewed emphasis on trade liberalisation again. It just isn't operating through the World Trade Organization. But countries do broadly see that their economic interests continue to be tied to global economic opportunity. We are not responding in the same way as the Great Depression. That is good for freedom. That is good for the free movement of cargo, of labour, of services across borders. That is good for economic development, that is good for property rights, that is good for the individual as well. That doesn't mean we aren't seeing concerning signs. For instance, of course, there is a continual assault on internet freedom, which is both central to commerce, but also to individual liberty. And of course we have the ongoing problem of China and other countries wishing to censor the internet, but also new regulations existing in places like Brazil, where they want to place protectionist measures to force particular services bound by the internet to be hosted in Brazil in the hope that it will spur a local industry. But of course just burns and shackles their industry in the process and undermines collaboration and undermines the use of intellectual property for growth. But more than anything else, of course, the internet has provided a huge opportunity and avenue for people to express themselves. And we can't underestimate the enormous contribution it has made to promoting freedom and liberty all around the world. And yes, of course, it's come up at different times, in particular social revolutions or changes, say for instance in Middle Eastern countries and the role that Twitter can play in drawing attention to horrific crimes being imposed by government. But of course, it's also shown a lie to the role of censorship in society overall. Once upon a time, of course, we had an elite attitude, which is that the public couldn't possibly see things for being corrupted. Yet today, that entire barrier has been removed, and people have been able to access information which has generated or come as a consequence of great human ingenuity and the best of our imagination, while also including the sewer of our worst thoughts and impulses. But I think by and large, nobody would argue that it has not been an entirely beneficial thing to have. The challenge is how we make sure that we continue to tackle things which are crimes and which are legitimate restrictions on people's rights. For instance, continuing to challenge the corruption and consequences of things like child pornography. But the overall conclusion is, of course, the internet has been enormously beneficial for human expression and for freedom. But of course, they're not the only challenges we face in terms of human rights around the world. You only need to look at the challenges that are being faced in the Middle East at the moment to say that freedom is directly under assault by militants who want to impose their worldview on others. Now, I'm not an expert in IS, and so I don't seek to go into a grand discussion about it. But I do think we have to be very open and realistic about the threat that groups like IS pose. Some people might say that you have one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I have never subscribed to that theory. I think it's completely false. The reality is a freedom fighter can only be somebody who ever seeks to to advance the rights of the individual so that everybody in society can live their lives as they see fit. If you seek authority and to seize control of government simply to impose your own worldview and to oppress other people, you are not a freedom fighter, you are just one form of militant or oppressor. And of course, we see the very real human consequences of what happens when people seize control of the state to advance these particular causes, particularly for minority groups who may not fit part of a conventional cultural or religious norm. And so I say in particular women, gays, non-Muslims, and in fact moderate Muslims in large parts of this world. And of course there is horrific consequences for these people. And if we want to see the sobering reality of how much risk there is out there in the world, not just in foreign lands but our own, you just need to look at the events of Ottawa of today. And that of course brings me to national security laws, because of course there is nothing that would undermine freedom more globally than for those of us in countries who have a higher degree of freedom and liberty and rights to backtrack. And this is part of the tension of what the federal government is looking at the moment in terms of national security laws. But I have to say, far too many people have been missing from the discussion. We had the first tranche of national security laws which didn't generate any real attention until after they had passed the Senate, and particularly from the media, who were concerned about provision 35P, which dealt with reporting public reporting of special intelligence operations which are operated by ASIO. I first started speaking about this in September. It wasn't really until mid-October before any journalists bothered to call or contact me about and ask my opinion. Of course, these provisions are enormously challenging if you believe in free speech. The idea that you can take a subject matter completely off the table around the operations of government and national security and imprison people for up to 10 years if we seek to do so. But there is a contesting human rights discussion in it, and this has also largely been missing in terms of public discussion. Special intelligence operations largely are actions where ASIO officers go into undercover operations for prolonged periods of time, sometimes up to 6 years. To simply report on them without due awareness of the consequence of reporting can put people's lives at risk. So there is a real tension. But the provisions that went through the Parliament were far too broad. They simply said reporting on a special intelligence operation ever would lead you to conviction of up to 10 years. I made a series of recommendations, including that it should be curtailed to one, when special intelligence operations are completed and no longer have any relevance to a current special intelligence operation, it should be reportable. But equally, if somebody's health or safety is at risk, that it should also be exempt from the law. We now, of course, are talking about the foreign fighters legislation, which only yesterday the government announced they are going to adopt all the recommendations in the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security's recommendations. But again, it places challenges on freedom of speech and that tension that exists about how far we should restrict it, particularly on the provision around advocacy of terrorism and how much the government should limit what people can say. Traditionally, we look at provision standards like incitement of violence or imminent violence against people as the basis in which you should restrict freedom of speech. But how far back from that basic proposition do we go, particularly in terms of terrorism? The Parliamentary Committee actually recommended to the government they need to clarify this provision because it was currently too broad. Equally, they were wary of the provision around declared areas where the Foreign Minister has the capacity to look at a particular country or particular part of the country and say anybody who seeks to go into that place commits a crime, regardless of the purpose, which is a fundamental criminalisation of freedom of movement. And the reality is people do have legitimate reasons to go to some places in the world, even if they are hotly contested areas. For religious pilgrimage, because they might have family there, because they may have friends there, because they may seek to go and save somebody who is in that particular location. But the much bigger concern around some aspects of these laws, particularly declared areas, is the approach the government is taking. And this isn't to demonise the government, because I think they're wrestling with very difficult issues. What they have sought to do is criminalise the exercise of a human right and then prescribe legitimate behaviour, what you can do. That is anathema to a free society where everything is legal until it is made explicitly illegal. Now they're saying this is illegal and this is what you can do that is legal. And that has a very deleterious impact in terms of how you deal with exemptions and how that may operate, and it gives individuals a very poor sense of security about what they can do, particularly when they're doing things like travel. And normally when I go and mention that, particularly in audiences of groups, particularly multicultural groups, people normally nod and say, yes, that is a real problem, and this is a reversal of the very principle of liberal democracy. But then, of course, I point out that that is equally what Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act does, and then they seem disinterested in the point, which shows how important it is to be consistent about human rights if you want to stand up and defend them. Because in the end, freedom is messy. That is the nature of it. You have, in our country, $22 million going about their lives, seeking their opportunities, and you will always find areas of contention or debate about whether people are exercising their freedoms appropriately and what points you find contest. But there is one final area that I want to talk about where freedom is very much on the reverse. It was on the front page of The Economist last week, called, quote, "The Gay Divide." Now, I'm the Commissioner responsible for sexual orientation and gender identity in the Commission. There's never been somebody who's taken that as part of their full-time portfolio. But it's an area that's both of personal interest to me, but I think is of enormous interest and importance for the Commission's work. And across the world, there have been enormous advances in terms of the challenges faced by what are called LGBTI people, but lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people. And particularly in places like Australia, we've had decriminalisation of sexual activity, anti-discrimination laws that have been implemented. We, of course, are now having a robust discussion around marriage. But equally, there are lots of non-legislative measures that have been used to advance the rights and dignity of individuals in a free society. But the reality is, a lot of countries are heading in the opposite direction, and scarily fast. Nigeria and Uganda, of course, are standouts. But we're also seeing similar trends in Brunei, India, and Malaysia. And of course, part of it's a consequence of cultural conservatism, but also religious conservatism as well. If you look at what's happening to gay and lesbian people in Russia and the brutality they face, not just in terms of citizen to citizen, but also in terms of the blind eye that's paid by police to brutality, it is not something I think we can sit idly by and say nothing about. It concerns me very deeply about what impact it has for a human rights agenda around the world and for a freedom agenda. And I can't think of a bigger frontier in human rights around the world today. There is no global leadership on this issue. People are being bullied, harassed, tortured, murdered around the world, and there is literally no global leadership pretty much anywhere. We have no institutions to deal with it. If you talk about issues around domestic violence for women, you have institutions under the UN to deal with this. Nothing if it's for people on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. They, of course, touched on very serious cultural and religious issues, so no significant political figure pretty much anywhere in the world is prepared to stand up and speak out and hang their hat on it. Not just because of how it's being perceived in those countries, but equally how it's perceived in domestic constituencies, and the fact that people don't want to be seen to be rattling the tin. Recently there was a World AIDS Conference in Melbourne, and I held an informal briefing session with a whole bunch of people from the developing world, particularly Africa, to talk about their experiences and what needs to be done to at least try and push back against some of the horrific crimes that have been committed there. And the issue around not just an absence of global leadership, but global institutions is real and has a huge consequence. There are no charities that really fundamentally deal with this violence. And even worse, even within the human rights and aid community, there is resistance to do anything about it. That might surprise people, but it's real. A lot of aid groups are, of course, religiously inspired, and so have tensions about the basic dignity of the individual if they happen to be LGBTI. That isn't to try and cast aspersions around charities broadly or even the tensions that they face. But I think when it comes to basic issues around violence, this is a no-brainer and something needs to be done. Recently, the Human Rights Commission, the body I work for, launched a comic book which we developed called Soju Story, and I'd recommend going and Googling it, sojustory.com.au. And it's a story about African teens who, of course, fall in love, who both happen to be men, and why there are very serious consequences they face in terms of law, in terms of social pressure, in terms of violence, and how that needs to be addressed and tackled if they're to have their rights fulfilled. It was designed in the form of a comic book so that it could not only be used to educate national human rights institutions and people who are interested in human rights in Africa, but more broadly to then be used to educate the public in Africa about why these issues are important, and also so they communicate to people who are illiterate, which of course remains an issue in some parts of Africa. This is the greatest frontier and challenge we face in freedom in the world today, and of course for a lot of people it seems disconnected from them because it has no real impact on them. But in the same way that racism may not have had an impact on you, or sexism may not have had an impact on you, the decentralised consequences of having not just stagnation, but retreat about basic freedoms for people, and for people to be free of violence simply on a trivial reason like how they happen to be born, is very real and is becoming much more problematic, and we need a lot more effort and energy and a lot more leadership to tackle it by countries all around the world. Thank you very much.